Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are tackling, well, one of the biggest ideas ever. We're going back to 1859.
We are. We're looking at Charles Darwin and what he himself called the mystery of mysteries, the origin of species.
And our goal here isn't just to say, yep, evolution happened. We want to really unpack the mechanism, the actual engine Darwin proposed for how life changes.
Exactly. And we're using his 1859 abstract of a draft on the origin of species as our guide. It's the core argument.
Now, this wasn't something he just dashed off, was it? Even though the publication itself was rushed.
Oh, not at all. The thinking went way back. He started collecting facts seriously in 1837, right after the Beagle voyage.
Right. Those 5 years at sea must have filled his head with questions.
Absolutely. Seeing the way creatures were distributed in South America, how living animals seemed related to the fossils nearby. It all pushed him towards needing a new explanation. He actually had his main ideas sketched out by 1844.
But he didn't publish then. What finally pushed him?
Pressure. Another naturalist, Alfred Russel Wallace, who was working out in the Malay archipelago, independently came up with, as Darwin put it, almost exactly the same general conclusions.
Wow. So it was a race?
In a way, it forced Darwin to get his ideas out quickly. That's why this 1859 work is technically an abstract. He even says he has to ask the reader to trust him on the details because he couldn't include all the references he'd gathered over 20 years.
Okay, so what's the core mission for us and for you listening? What did Darwin feel he had to explain?
It was more than just saying species change into other species, like varieties do. He needed to show how. What's the actual mechanism? How do you get, the incredible perfection of structure and co-adaptation we see everywhere? Think about a bird's wing or an eye. How does that happen step by step?
Right, it's the means of modification. That's the key.
That's the key. He needed a mechanism that could explain that exquisite fit between an organism and its world.
Okay, let's get into this mechanism. And interestingly, Darwin doesn't start out in the wild, in the jungle or the deep sea. He starts somewhere much closer to home.
Yeah, he starts with domesticated animals and cultivated plants. He felt this offered the best and safest clue to figuring out the bigger puzzle.
Why there? Why pigeons and cabbages?
Because under domestication, variation is just. Well, it's much more obvious. Naturalists at the time were often focused on how stable wild species seemed, but farmers and breeders knew that their stocks varied. Domestication kind of amplifies that natural tendency to vary.
So we humans, by messing with animals and plants, make the underlying variability easier to see.
Exactly. We become the selective agent, and we can watch it happen. But the first step, Darwin says, is just recognizing this inherent tendency to vary.
And what did he think caused that variation in the first place?
He pointed to the reproductive system. It seems to be the part of an organism most easily affected by changes in the conditions of life, things like being confined or changes in diet or climate.
Ah, so shaking up an organism's life often affects its ability to reproduce.
Right. Sometimes it causes sterility, which is obviously a dead end. But other times, those same disturbances seem to increase variability in the offspring. He even says this instability is the source of all the choicest productions of the garden.
It's like the disruption creates the potential, the raw material for change.
Precisely. And this leads to domestic races often looking quite different from wild species. They tend to be less uniform.
And he uses this word monstrous, doesn't he? Not like scary monsters, but
more like exaggerated in one particular feature. Think about some fancied pigeon breeds with incredibly short beaks or flowers with way more petals than the wild version. One part is developed to an extreme.
This visible difference caused a lot of debate back then, right? About whether, say, all domestic cattle came from one wild ancestor or several.
Huge debates. Experts couldn't agree on things like cattle or sheep or even goats descended from a single wild stock or from multiple different wild species that were independently domesticated.
So how did Darwin argue his case, especially for things like pigeons, where the breeds look so incredibly different? You have huge ones, tiny ones, ones that tumble in the air.
He was a strong believer in a single origin for most domestic groups. He argued all poultry came from the wild Indian fowl, and crucially for his argument, all the wildly different domestic pigeons came from just one ancestor, the common rock pigeon, columbolivia.
And his evidence for this single origin.
The key was the principle of reversion.
Reversion, meaning they go back to looking like the ancestor.
Exactly. If you take two very different highly bred pigeon breeds, say a carrier with its long beak and wattles and a tiny tumbler, and you cross them, what often happens?
What? They average out.
Sometimes, but quite often, the offspring, maybe in the second or third generation, will suddenly show the characteristics of the wild rock pigeon. The bluish-gray color, the two black bars on the wings, the white rump.
Ah, so these ancestral traits are still lurking underneath the fancy modifications.
Precisely. If the domestic breeds had come from, say, 5 different wild species of different colors and patterns, crossing them should just produce a random mix, a kind of muddle. But the fact they consistently revert back to the specific pattern of the rock pigeon strongly suggests that's their shared ancestor.
That makes sense. It shows how much hidden potential for variation exists within just one species.
And that hidden potential is exactly what selection works on. Man becomes the selector, picking out the variations he finds useful or interesting.
Darwin talks about two kinds of selection by humans. The first one is pretty obvious, methodical selection.
Right, that's the conscious effort. The pigeon fancier, who wants a shorter beak, selects birds with slightly shorter beaks generation after generation. The horse breeder, aiming for speed, selects the fastest runners. It's deliberate, goal-oriented.
Skillful, practiced, and relatively quick in creating things like a dray horse versus a racehorse.
Yes. But then there's the second type, which Darwin thought was maybe even more important as an analogy for nature: unconscious selection.
Unconscious? How does that work if nobody's consciously trying to change anything?
It's more subtle. It happens when people simply preserve the best individuals they have, without any long-term plan to change the breed or variety.
Like the example of the gooseberry.
Exactly. A gardener just saves seeds from the bush that produce the slightly larger, slightly tastier gooseberries that year. He's not trying to create a giant gooseberry over decades.
He just wants slightly better gooseberries next year.
Right, but because everyone tends to do this, keep the best, discard the worst over many generations, the average size or quality of the gooseberry slowly, steadily increases. It's an accumulation of small preferred differences without a conscious goal.
And the effect over long periods can be huge.
Huge. Darwin points out that for many of our oldest cultivated plants, like vegetables and flowers that have been grown for centuries, we often can't even recognize their wild ancestors anymore. They've been changed so much by this slow, unconscious accumulation of slight improvements. Think about modern pears compared to the original wild, hard, sour things they came from.
So summing up this section on domestication.
Darwin concludes that this power of selection, whether it's methodical and fast or unconscious and slow, is the main driving force behind the changes we see in domestic plants and animals. It's the predominant power.
And the implication is, if humans can do this with their relatively limited time and focus,
what could the relentless, environment-driven forces of nature achieve over millions of years? That's the bridge to the next part.
Okay, so we leave the farm and the garden where humans are in charge and we head out into the wild. Darwin needs to show that the same basic principles apply, but with a different selector.
Exactly. First, he has to establish that the raw material variation is also present in nature. And he argues it absolutely is. He talks about individual differences.
Meaning no two wild animals or plants are ever exactly identical.
Precisely. He says they aren't cast in the same mold. There are always slight differences, maybe in size or color intensity or proportions. And these differences, even if they seem tiny or affect unimportant parts, are crucial. They are the essential materials for natural selection to work with.
This seems to challenge the whole idea of a fixed species that people held onto so tightly.
It does. Darwin started to see the term species as somewhat arbitrary, really, a label of convenience for naturalists. For him, a group within a species that consistently differs from the main type was basically an incipient species.
A species in the making.
Yes. The difference between a variety and a species wasn't one of kind, but simply of degree. How much difference had accumulated.
Did he see any patterns in which species tended to vary more?
He did notice a general rule. In any given region, the species belonging to the larger genera, the groups that contain many species, and are often widespread and common, tend to vary more than species in smaller, rarer genera.
Why would that be? More opportunities.
That seems to be the idea. If a group is successful, widespread, and numerous, it just generates more individuals, and therefore more chances for slight variations to pop up. It gives selection more options to work with.
Okay, so nature provides the variation, but what's the force, the pressure that does the selecting? This is where it gets intense, right? The struggle for existence.
Absolutely. This is where Darwin brings in the ideas of Thomas Malthus about population.
Malthus, the guy who worried about human population outstripping food supply.
The very same. Darwin realized this applied to all living things. Every organism has the potential to increase its numbers geometrically. one pair producing many offspring, each of those pairs producing many more.
Like compound interest, but with lives.
Exactly. If there were no checks, any single species could cover the Earth in a surprisingly short time. A single elephant pair, he calculated, could lead to millions in a few centuries. But obviously that doesn't happen.
So something must be limiting the numbers.
Something is always limiting the numbers. As Darwin put it, more individuals are produced than can possibly survive. This inevitably leads to a struggle.
And this struggle isn't just lions chasing zebras, is it?
No, it's much broader. It's a struggle between individuals of the same species competing for the same food or mates. It's a struggle between different species predators and prey, or two kinds of plants competing for light and water. And it's also a struggle against the physical environment: drought, cold, heat.
It's a constant battle on multiple fronts.
And the specific things that limit populations the checks are often really hard to pin down. It might not be obvious predators.
Like what?
Well, maybe a disease sweeps through, especially if the population gets too dense. He mentions epidemics in game animals sometimes being linked to parasitic worms that thrive when their hosts are numerous. Or simply, a huge number of eggs or seeds get eaten before they even have a chance to develop.
So high birth rates are needed just to balance out the massive early losses.
Yes, and a key insight here is the deep interconnectedness in nature. Things are rarely simple cause and effect.
What do you mean? Like, if it gets colder, the species just dies out?
Not necessarily just from the cold itself. Darwin argued that often when a species is struggling at the edge of its range, say trying to live further north, the slight change in climate might not kill it directly. Instead, the change might slightly favor one of its competitors, or maybe a predator or disease.
Ah, so the conditions tip the balance in the struggle.
Exactly. The competitor increases, and since the environment is already basically fully stocked, as he says, the original species just gets squeezed out, it loses the competition.
He had some great examples of this interconnectedness, didn't he? The heathland.
Oh, the Staffordshire Heath example is brilliant. It was a barren piece of land. Then part of it was enclosed, fenced off, and planted with Scotch fir trees. What happened?
Things changed.
Dramatically. 12 new species of plants started thriving there that weren't on the open heath. And 6 new species of insect-eating birds became common.
All because of the trees.
Not just the trees themselves. The crucial factor was the enclosure. The fence kept out the cattle. Darwin found evidence that on the unenclosed part of the heath, young fir trees were constantly being browsed down by cattle. He found one little tree that had tried for 26 years to grow taller than the surrounding heather, but failed because cattle kept nipping its top off.
So removing the cattle allowed the firs to grow, which changed the whole environment, allowing new plants and the birds that fed on the insects living on those plants.
Precisely. The presence or absence of cattle determined the entire ecosystem.
Wow. And the other example, the fly in South America.
Yes, the Paraguay fly. He observed that in the areas around Paraguay, feral horses, cattle, and dogs were abundant. But in Paraguay itself, they couldn't establish wild populations. Why?
The fly.
Apparently, due to a specific fly that lays its eggs in the navels of newborn animals, killing them.
Gruesome. But the chain doesn't stop there, does it?
No. He speculates that the numbers of this deadly fly are likely kept in check by certain insectivorous birds. And the numbers of those birds are probably controlled by birds of prey, hawks.
So follow the chain. More hawks could mean fewer insect-eating birds, which means more deadly flies, which means fewer or no wild cattle and horses.
Exactly. A change in the hawk population could indirectly determine whether large mammals can survive in the region. It shows these incredibly complex links across totally different kinds of creatures.
Okay, so the picture is, nature is full of variation, and it's locked in this constant complex struggle where tiny advantages matter because the competition is so fierce, the stage is set for selection.
Right, now we bring the two pieces together. If variation happens, and there's a struggle for survival, what's the logical outcome?
The ones with helpful variations are more likely to survive and reproduce.
That's the heart of it. Darwin reasoned, if humans can select for traits they find useful, surely variations must occur in nature that are useful to the organism itself in its own battle of life.
And if such a useful variation appears,
any individual possessing it, even if it's just a very slight advantage, will have a better chance of surviving, finding a mate, and leaving offspring. And those offspring are likely to inherit that advantageous trait.
so nature selects the individuals that are better suited.
Yes. Nature preserves the favorable variations and eliminates the unfavorable ones. Over huge stretches of geological time, this process accumulates, leading to organisms that are incredibly well adapted to their way of life. He argues nature's productions are infinitely better adapted than man's, because man selects for his own purposes, while nature selects purely for the good of the being itself.
And this selection can operate on really subtle things, right? Not just big, obvious traits.
Absolutely. He stresses that selection acts on seemingly trifling characters as long as they provide some benefit. Camouflage is a classic example.
Like insects matching their background.
Exactly. Leaf-eating insects tend to be green. Bark feeders are mottled gray. He mentions grouse changing color seasonally or geographically white in snowy winters, heather-colored on moorland, peaty-colored in other areas, all to avoid being seen by hawks.
Tiny differences in shade make the difference between life and death.
And he brings it back to cultivation, too. He quotes an American fruit grower, Downing, who observed that smooth-skinned fruits were more vulnerable to a certain beetle than fruits with a bit of downy fuzz. And purple plums suffered more from a particular disease than yellow plums.
So even in a garden, with human help, these tiny differences affect survival.
Right. And if those small differences matter there, Darwin argues, how much more critical must they be in the relentless struggle of wild nature? They could easily determine which variety flourishes and which one gets wiped out.
There's also a point about when selection acts, wasn't there? It doesn't just affect adults.
Crucial point. Selection can modify an organism at any stage of its life, as long as the variation is inherited at roughly the same age.
So it could adapt a caterpillar to avoid predators.
Precisely. Selection might strongly favor changes in a larva or a seed to improve its chances of survival, even if those changes indirectly affect the structure of the adult later on, perhaps in ways that aren't directly useful to the adult itself.
Okay, so that's natural selection for survival, but there's another kind of selection too.
Yes, sexual selection. This doesn't necessarily help the organism survive in the environment, but it helps it reproduce.
How does that work?
It's about advantages certain individuals, usually males, have over other individuals of the same sex in competition for mates.
Like bigger antlers on deer or brighter feathers on birds.
Exactly. It could be weapons for fighting rivals, like antlers, means of defense, like the lion's mane protecting its throat in fights, or simply charms, bright colors, elaborate songs, displays that attract females.
And the winners pass on those traits.
The winners leave more offspring, and those offspring, particularly the males, inherit the successful weapons or ornaments. This explains why males and females of the same species often look so different, even if they live in basically the same way.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, the really big step. How do these small selected differences pile up to create entirely new species? This is the divergence of character.
This is maybe the most crucial part of the mechanism after selection itself. The question is, how do varieties, which are just slightly different forms, become species which are distinctly different?
It's not just random drifting apart.
No, Darwin argues it's driven by an ecological principle. The more diversified the descendants of a species become in their structure, their habits, how they make a living, the better they become at exploiting different resources or parts of the environment.
Like specializing.
Exactly. Think of it like division of labor. If all the descendants stay the same, they're all competing intensely for the exact same food and space. But if some descendants develop slightly different traits that allow them to use a slightly different food source or live in a slightly different habitat, they face less competition.
So diversification allows more individuals to survive in total.
Yes. They can seize on widely diversified places in the economy of nature, as he puts it, and therefore increase their total numbers.
Did he have evidence for this? It sounds logical, but...
He pointed to agricultural experiments. People had found that if you sow a plot of land with just one type of grass, you get a certain amount of hay. But if you sow the same plot with several different kinds of grasses, or even different varieties of the same grass,
you get more hay.
Significantly more. Because the different types utilize the resources more completely, some have deeper roots, some grow better in shade, etc. They aren't all competing for the exact same patch of soil and sunlight.
Nature benefits from diversity. A simultaneous rotation, he called it.
Right. So in nature, the descendants that diverge most, that become most different from their siblings and cousins, are the ones that are most likely to find an open niche and thrive.
And what happens to the ones in the middle, the intermediate forms?
They get squeezed out. The most distinct varieties are favored, they increase in number, and they tend to outcompete and eventually eliminate the less distinct varieties, and especially the original parent form, which is now competing with its more specialized offspring.
So the gaps between forms actually widen over time because the intermediates are lost.
That's the key idea. Slight differences become greater differences. Varieties become species. And eventually, species become distinct enough to be classified in different genera.
Which brings us to the flip side of new species arising.
Extinction. It's not just bad luck. Darwin sees extinction as the inevitable consequence of natural selection and divergence.
Oh, so?
As new, improved, more specialized forms arise and spread, who do they compete most fiercely with?
The ones most similar to them, their closest relative.
Exactly. They compete most intensely with their most closely allied forms, other varieties of the same species, or other species in the same genus. These older, less improved forms are driven to become rarer and rarer, and ultimately, they disappear. One group's success necessitates another's failure.
Okay, Darwin's built this powerful logical machine. Variation, struggle, selection, divergence, extinction. But he knew people would have objections, right? Big ones.
Oh, absolutely. He confronts them head on. He calls them difficulties on the theory, and he devotes a lot of space to them.
What's the first major hurdle he tackles?
Probably the biggest one, then and now, the rarity of transitional forms.
The missing links. If species changed gradually, step by step, shouldn't the fossil record be full of all the intermediate stages? Why do species often seem to appear suddenly?
It's a powerful objection. His main defense is to turn the spotlight onto the imperfection of the geological record.
Yeah.
He argues we have absolutely no right to expect a complete record.
Why not? Don't rocks preserve things?
Only under very specific conditions. Fossils generally form in sediment laid down underwater. This usually happens when land is sinking, subsidence.
Yeah.
But what about the long periods when land is stable or, crucially, rising elevation?
No sediment is laid down then.
Generally not. In fact, existing sediments might be eroding away. So the record is blank during potentially vast stretches of time, and periods of elevation might be exactly when environmental changes are happening and species are migrating or adapting most rapidly, but we wouldn't get fossils from that time.
So the record is like a book with most of the pages ripped out.
Worse. He says it's like only the last volume of a multi-volume encyclopedia exists, and even that volume has most of its pages missing, and only a few lines preserved on each remaining page. The intervals between known fossil-bearing formations are likely vastly longer than the time represented by the formations themselves.
Okay, that makes the lack of smooth transitions seem less surprising.
And he adds another point. When a new variety first arises, it's probably in a limited area. It only spreads widely after it has become significantly modified and successful. So by the time it's widespread enough to be commonly fossilized, it already looks like a distinct new species. The local gradual steps that got it there probably happened elsewhere or weren't preserved.
Nature guarded against the frequent discovery of her transitional forms, as he put it.
A very effective way to frame it.
Okay, what's the next big difficulty? Things like weird structures or habits.
Yes, the origin of peculiar habits and structures. How could something like a land animal evolve into an aquatic one? Wouldn't the intermediate stage be clumsy on land and clumsy on water and just die out?
The what use is half a wing kind of argument.
Exactly. Darwin counters this by pointing to existing animals with transitional habits. He mentions the mink, Mustela vism, in North America.
What does it do?
In summer, it dives and catches fish like an otter, using its webbed feet. But in winter, it hunts mice and other small animals on land, like its weasel relatives. It's perfectly successful living this intermediate lifestyle.
So transitional habits are possible. What about transitional structures?
He uses the squirrel family as an example of transitions in structure. You can find squirrels with ordinary bushy tails, then others with slightly flattened tails, then species with more skin stretched between their limbs, all the way to the flying squirrels, which have a broad membrane allowing them to glide long distances.
Each step is useful in its own way.
Plausibly, yes. A slightly flatter tail might help with balance when jumping. More skin aids, shorter glides, until you get the full parachute effect. It shows how a complex structure like a gliding membrane could evolve through intermediate useful stages.
He also talked about organs changing their job over time, right? Functional conversion.
Yes, this is fascinating. Organs originally developed for one purpose can be modified by selection to serve a completely different purpose later on.
Like the swim bladder in fish.
That's the classic example. It likely started as an organ for buoyancy, but in some lineages it was modified into an air-breathing lung, allowing fish to survive in oxygen-poor water or even spend time on land. Selection repurposed an existing structure.
He used a really detailed example from his own work on barnacles too, didn't he?
He did. He studied barnacles, or cirripedes extensively. In one group, there are tiny skin folds, ovigerous frena, that just hold the eggs in place and maybe help a tiny bit with breathing. But in another, very different group of barnacles, Balanidae, those same basic folds seem to have been hugely enlarged and elaborated into complex gills, branchiae, the main breathing organs.
So, a structure that was originally just for holding eggs got co-opted and modified for respiration.
That's his interpretation. It shows how complex organs don't necessarily have to arise from nothing. Selection can tinker with existing parts and give them new important functions.
Okay, but what about really strange, unique organs? Like the electric organs in some fish. They appear in unrelated groups. How did those evolve step by step?
Darwin admits this is a tough one. He acknowledges the difficulty and doesn't pretend to know the exact steps. He points out that electric organs seem structurally related to muscles, suggesting they might be modified muscle tissue.
But the intermediate steps are missing.
The specific pathway is unknown. He speculates that sometimes, perhaps, natural selection might arrive at a similar solution independently in different lineages if they face similar needs, like two inventors hitting on the same idea separately. It's convergent evolution, driven by selection.
What about organs that seem to be disappearing? Rudimentary organs.
Ah, yes. Things like the eyes of moles or other burrowing animals like the tuco-tuco. These eyes are often tiny, sometimes covered by skin, effectively blind.
Why would that happen? Just disuse.
Darwin thought disuse played a big part. If you don't use an organ, it tends to shrink over generations.
Yeah.
But he also suggested selection might help this process along. If burrowing animals constantly get dirt in their eyes, leading to inflammation.
Then having smaller, protected, or even absent eyes could actually be an advantage, less risk of infection.
Exactly. Selection could favor the reduction. And he points to blind cave animals, fish, insects, even mammals found in deep caves in both Europe and America. These creatures are blind, but they are related to the sighted animals living on the surface in their respective continents.
Not related to cave animals on the other continent.
No. This strongly suggests they didn't somehow migrate as blind animals across oceans. Instead, sighted surface animals must have independently colonized caves on each continent, and then gradually, over generations in total darkness, disuse and possibly selection led to the loss of eyes, often accompanied by enhanced senses like longer antennae.
It makes sense only if they descended from sighted ancestors nearby.
Okay, structures are one thing, but what about behavior? Especially complex, seemingly innate behaviors, instincts. How does his theory explain those? Can selection shape behavior?
This must have been a huge challenge, as instincts often seem so perfect and purposeful.
It was. But Darwin applied the same logic. First, do instincts vary? Yes, they do. He notes things like the migratory urge being stronger in some individuals than others, or birds varying slightly in how they build their nests depending on available materials or location.
So if instincts vary, even slightly,
Then natural selection can potentially act on that variation. If a slight change in an instinct makes an animal more likely to survive or reproduce, that behavioral tweak can be favored and accumulated over generations, just like a physical trait.
but what about learning or habit? Didn't people think instincts were just inherited habits?
That was a common idea, Lamarckian inheritance. But Darwin had a killer counter-argument. The neuter insects. Think about worker ants or bees.
They don't reproduce, they're sterile.
Exactly. Yet they perform incredibly complex instincts, building the hive, foraging, defending the colony, raising the young. Since they have no offspring themselves, they cannot pass on any habits they might acquire during their lifetime.
So their complex instincts can't be the result of inheriting habits.
Right. Their specific structures and instincts must have been shaped by natural selection acting on the fertile parents, the queen and drones, that produce those useful sterile workers. Selection favors the colonies whose queens produce the most effective workers. It's selection at the family or colony level.
That's a powerful point against inherited habits. Okay, so how did he show instincts could evolve gradually? The ants.
The slave-making instinct of ants is an amazing case study he uses to show gradation. He compares two species.
One extreme, one intermediate.
Yes. The extreme is Formica rufescens. These ants are completely dependent on their slaves, which are ants of a different species captured as pupa. The rufescens masters literally do nothing else. They can't build nests, gather food, or even feed themselves.
Slaves have to feed them.
Yes. If you take away their slaves, the masters will starve, even if food is piled around them. The slaves run the whole show, even carrying the masters when the colony moves.
Wow. That's extreme dependency. What's the intermediate?
Formica sanguinea. This species also captures slaves from other ant species. But they aren't completely helpless. The sanguine masters do work alongside their slaves. They forage, help build the nest, and decide when to migrate. The slaves are more like helpers.
So you see a possible pathway. How could this start?
Darwin suggested it might have started simply. Many ants will instinctively carry off pupa of other species if they find them scattered maybe originally as a source of food.
Okay, grabbing food.
But what if, by chance, some of those captured pupae weren't eaten, but hatched inside the captor's nest? And what if those newly hatched ants, acting on their own instincts, started doing useful things, like tending the larva or cleaning the nest?
The captors would benefit accidentally.
Exactly. If having these accidental helpers proved useful, selection could then favor the tendency to collect pupae not for food, but specifically for the purpose of raising slaves. From that starting point, selection could gradually refine the instinct, leading eventually to the total dependency seen in F. rufescens.
A plausible, step-by-step explanation for really bizarre behavior. What about the bees? The honeycomb structure seems impossibly perfect.
The cell-making instinct of the hive bee. This was seen as a pinnacle of instinctual perfection. Bees build these perfect hexagonal cells, using the absolute minimum amount of wax to hold the maximum amount of honey. It's a marvel of engineering.
How could selection produce something so geometrically precise?
Again, Darwin looked for gradations. He pointed out simpler related behaviors. First, you have humblebees. They make rough, rounded wax pots, often reusing old cocoons. No real geometry there.
Okay, step one, messy circles.
Then, he looked at a stingless bee from Mexico, Melipona domestica. These bees build cells that are roughly cylindrical, but also nearly spherical honeypots clustered together.
Getting closer.
Here's the key observation with Melipona. Where two of their spherical cells touch, the bees don't let the spheres intersect or break. Instead, they build a perfectly flat wall of wax exactly at the plane of intersection.
Ah, they solve the intersection problem.
Yes. From there, Darwin argued, it's a relatively small step to the perfect hive bee comb. If you imagine bees trying to build perfectly spherical cells, arranging them in layers on opposite sides of a sheet, and making them just the right distance apart so that each cell naturally intersects with 3 cells on its own side and 3 on the opposite side.
Then the bees, by building flat walls at all those intersection points, would automatically create the hexagonal prism shape.
Exactly. They don't need to understand geometry. They just need the instinct to stand at the right distance from each other while secreting wax, try to make spherical hollows, and build flat walls where their spheres meet. He even did experiments showing bees excavate wax, starting with circular pits that naturally form intersections.
So the perfection arises from simple actions and the physics of packing spheres.
Pretty much. And because wax is costly for bees to produce, they consume a lot of honey to make it, any slight variation in behavior that saved even a tiny amount of wax would be strongly favored by natural selection. Over time, this would drive the instinct towards maximum efficiency, the perfect hexagon.
Okay, Darwin's used variation, struggle, and selection to explain adaptation, divergence, extinction, even complex instincts. Now he broadens the scope again, showing how this theory makes sense of how scientists already organized life.
Yes, he argues that the way naturalists classify organisms, grouping species into genera into families, and so on, isn't just arbitrary labeling. It actually reflects genealogy or descent.
So the classification system is basically a family tree.
That's exactly how he saw it. The nested hierarchy groups within groups within groups is the natural result of species descending from common ancestors with modification and then diverging over time. It reflects branching patterns of evolution.
This view must have shed light on some puzzling biological facts, like homology.
Absolutely. Homology is the strange similarity in underlying structure between parts that do very different jobs in different animals. Think about the bones in your hand, a bat's wing, a porpoise's flipper, and a horse's leg.
They look different and do different things.
But the underlying pattern of bones is remarkably similar. Why should that be if each was created independently for its specific function?
Darwin's answer.
They share that underlying pattern because they all inherited it from a common ancestor. The ancestral limb structure was then modified by natural selection for different purposes, grasping, flying, swimming, running. But the fundamental blueprint remains, revealing the shared ancestry. It gives homology plain signification, he says.
It makes sense of the underlying unity of life. Okay, but there was still a big sticking point for the idea that species are just well-marked varieties, hybrid sterility.
Yes, this was perhaps the most common objection. Generally, when you cross distinct species, The offspring, hybrids, are sterile, like a mule. But when you cross different varieties of the same species, the offspring are usually fertile. This looks like a fundamental difference.
So how did Darwin deal with this apparent sharp line between species and varieties?
He argued forcefully that the sterility of hybrids is not a special adaptation deliberately created to keep species separate. Instead, he believed it was an incidental consequence of other differences that accumulated in the reproductive systems while the two lineages were diverging.
Incidental, meaning just a byproduct.
Yes. Like, as two populations adapt to different conditions over a long time, their reproductive systems might just happen to become incompatible, almost by accident. It wasn't designed to prevent blending.
What was his evidence that it wasn't a deliberate barrier?
Several things. First, the degree of sterility varies enormously. Some species crosses produce perfectly fertile hybrids, some produce weakly fertile ones, some produce completely sterile ones, and some won't cross at all. It's not an all-or-nothing rule.
It's messy.
Very messy. And crucially, reciprocal crosses often give different results. Crossing male A with female B might produce sterile offspring, but crossing male B with female A might produce fertile offspring. If sterility was a specific barrier between species A and B, it should work both ways equally.
That difference suggests it's due to some specific interaction issue, not a general species barrier.
Exactly. He also compared it to how changing conditions, like domestication or captivity, can sometimes cause sterility or increased variability in pure species. He saw hybrid sterility as a similar kind of disruption of the sensitive reproductive system, resulting from bringing together two systems that had evolved subtle incompatibilities.
Okay, moving on to the big picture, geographical distribution. How did life get spread all over the planet?
The basic view, which Darwin shared, was that each species probably originated in one place, a single center of creation, and then spread out from there through migration and reproduction.
And the patterns we see different continents having different faunas are explained by barriers.
Largely, yes. Oceans, deserts, high mountain ranges act as barriers that prevent species from spreading everywhere. That's why related groups of organisms are often found in geographically connected areas.
But sometimes related species are found in very distant places. How do they cross those barriers, like oceans?
This is where Darwin emphasizes accidental means of transport. He did amazing experiments showing this wasn't just wild speculation.
Like the seeds in seawater.
Yes, he soaked hundreds of seeds from different plants in salt water for long periods. He found a surprising number could survive for weeks, even months. Given ocean current speeds, he calculated that seeds could potentially float for hundreds, even over 900 miles, and still germinate.
So long-distance dispersal by sea is possible. What else?
Seeds get transported in clumps of earth stuck to birds' feet. He found seeds in mud scraped from a partridge's leg. Wading birds, which travel long distances between ponds and lakes, could easily carry seeds from aquatic plants embedded in mud.
That explains why freshwater plants are often so widespread.
Exactly. Seeds can also travel in driftwood or even inside the crops or digestive tracts of birds that eat them and excrete them later, potentially far away. Given enough time, these occasional accidental events become probable means of dispersal across barriers.
And this connects to the idea of succession of types.
Yes. The observation that the fossils found in a region often resemble the living creatures in that same region. For example, fossil giant sloths are found in South America, where living sloths and armadillos, also edentates, are found. Fossil giant marsupials are found in Australia, where living marsupials dominate.
How does descent explain that?
It makes perfect sense if species originate locally and then modify over time. The inhabitants of South America millions of years ago were the ancestors of the modified inhabitants of South America today. It's a law of local succession through descent.
Okay, one last major area of evidence. Embryology, the study of developing embryos.
This was incredibly powerful evidence for Darwin. Naturalists had long been struck by how similar the embryos of very different animals within the same class, like vertebrates, look in their early stages.
The famous example of not being able to tell a human, bird, or reptile embryo apart very early on.
Right. Why would they be so similar early on, only to diverge into vastly different adult forms? Darwin's explanation ties back to when variations tend to appear and be inherited.
He thought variations usually appear later in development.
Yes, modifications that distinguish, say, a bird from a reptile tend to arise relatively late in their development and are inherited at that corresponding late stage.
So the earlier embryonic stages remain similar because they reflect the inherited pattern from the common ancestor before those later modifications kick in.
Precisely. The embryo is like a window into the ancestral past. The reason human embryos have structures resembling gill slits isn't because we need them, but because we inherited that developmental stage from distant fish-like ancestors. Selection has modified the later stages to produce lungs, but the early blueprint remains, revealing the relationship. Hashtag outro. So when you put it all together, Darwin argued that his mechanism descent with modification through variation and natural selection could explain this huge range of facts. The way we classify life, the underlying similarities or homologies, the geographical distribution patterns, the existence of rudimentary organs, the similarities in embryos, even complex instincts.
It provides a unifying framework for biology.
It really does. And he acknowledged the difficulties, like the imperfect fossil record or the exact steps in evolving something like an electric organ. But he saw these not as reasons to reject the theory, but as areas where more knowledge was needed, challenges for future investigation.
The theory itself wasn't invalidated by gaps in knowledge.
No. And perhaps the biggest shift was in perspective. He argued that studying natural history becomes far more interesting when you stop seeing organisms as fixed, separate creations,
And start seeing them
as historical beings, products of a long process of change. Every complex structure, every instinct, is the summing up of many contrivances, the result of countless small modifications accumulated over eons.
It makes terms like relationship or affinity literal, not just metaphorical.
Exactly. They gain plain signification. They refer to actual blood relationships, to genealogy. The classification system becomes a real family tree.
And he ends, famously, by looking towards the future.
Yes. He suggests this view opens up vast new fields of research, understanding the laws of variation, heredity, the precise interactions in the struggle for existence. And then, the electrifying final sentence of The Origin, though hinted at here in the abstract, that this work will eventually throw light on the origin of man and his history.
Bringing ourselves into the evolutionary picture. So a final thought for you, our listener. Darwin showed how the relentless pressure of the environment acting on tiny variations shapes life through divergence and specialization. As we navigate our own complex world, constantly adapting and competing in different ways, how might that deep principle of divergence be playing out not just biologically, but maybe even in our cultures and technologies? Something to think about.